Welcome back. These are the Franke Lectures in the Humanities at the Whitney Humanities Center. The title of the series is The Value of Marx's Capital. We're lucky today to have someone who spent a large part of his thinking life working out Marx's ideas about value, so we can give some meaning to that term. The series is a companion to an undergraduate seminar at Yale, so the students are in the house. Welcome, and also goes along with a new translation being done into English of Capital Volume 1 by my colleague Paul Reiter at OSU, who is for that reason a hero and will be on all of your desks in a couple of years, I hope. I am co-editing the volume with him, so getting a lot of pleasure thinking through Marx's text. I need to thank the Franke family who make possible the Franke Lectures. That is Richard and Barbara Franke, who endow these lectures to present important topics in the humanities to a wide and general audience. I'd like to thank Alice Kaplan, the director of the Whitney Humanities Center, Sandra Malan-Bowles, who is an administrator there, Leanna Hirschfeld-Kroen, who's the graduate assistant, and Audrey Leek, who's the undergraduate assistant. Without these people, we would not be fumbling around trying to make a TV-like presentation. Okay. The workshop tonight is going to run like this. I'm going to just lay it out for you. Professor Kliman will give his presentation. Then there will be some questions from the students in the seminar, and I'll ask that everyone else in the background, as I've been asking each time, hold on to their questions till the students get a chance. And then I'll open it up and you can put your questions in the chat. Anyone who's motivated to ask questions is welcome too. There will be a video made and they'll be available hopefully in about 2 weeks on the Whitney Humanities site. Now I'm going to turn over the broadcast to my colleague Paul Reiter, who will introduce our speaker.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and welcome to Andrew Kliman, who is a professor emeritus of economics at Pace University in Pleasantville, New York. He is the author of Reclaiming Marx, Reclaiming Marx's Capital, a refutation of the myth of inconsistency and the failure of capitalist, and also, sorry, I conflated those titles. Those are two different works, of course. So the one book is Reclaiming Marx's Capital, a refutation of the myth of inconsistency and the failure of capitalist production, underlying causes of the Great Recession. His research on value theory, economics, crisis theory, and other topics has appeared in numerous journals and book collections. He works with the Marxist-Humanist initiative and is co-host with Brendan Cooney of Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast, which appears bi-weekly. He has a very long and impressive CV that I'm not going to go through in detail. I'd just like to mention some recent accomplishments. His book on the failure of capitalist production recently appeared in Greek. The Spanish edition of Reclaiming Marx's Capital is coming out this year, and the German edition is coming out next year. He has recent articles on Trumpism and Trump's base and the anti-neoliberal left's relation to them. We haven't really talked all that much about Marx and current events, but this is clearly an opportunity to do that. He's the series editor of a Lexington book series called Heterodox Studies on the Critique of Political Economy. And he's the co-editor with Nick Potts of the recent volume, Is Marx's Theory of Profit Right? The Simultaneist Temporalist Debate. Again, Andrew, welcome. It's really great to have you here. I've appreciated your work on Marx and particularly Capital a lot. And I should say the title of your talk before I go and close the window from which a bunch of noise is coming. The title of the presentation today is Use Value and Exchange Value and Value. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you very much, Paul, and the other Paul, for inviting me. It's a real honor. and a pleasure to be able to do this colloquium. Shall I go straight ahead?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, so I'm going to talk for hopefully right around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we can have some discussion, comments, and questions. The concepts that I want to be talking about this evening: use value, exchange value, and value. These are basic building blocks of Marx's Capital. As we'll see, the meanings of these terms, and especially their relations to one another, are frequently misunderstood, even to this day. And when even the building blocks of a theory suffer from such misunderstanding, the edifice doesn't stand a chance. So I want to talk about how these terms were defined before Marx came along, and then I'll talk about the conceptual innovation he introduced, which was a clear distinction between exchange value and value. I want to talk about some common misconstruals of what the terms mean and how they're related. And we'll also see that one result of Marx's innovation is that there's a transformation of the key polarity or opposition. It had been between use value and exchange value. Okay, but Marx makes the opposition between use value and value into the key one. And I want to talk a bit about the implications of that transformation, and especially the role that the polarity between use value and value plays in Marx's theory of the fetishism of the commodity. But before doing any of that, I want to begin with a couple preliminary remarks about Capital's genre that I think are important in this context. And wrapped up with both of them is this fact that readers of Capital often get the sense that Marx, the author, really isn't speaking to them. And they're not wrong. The book doesn't speak directly to the reader, partly because it's a work of theory, principally, not a work of description. Theory and description are similar in that both of them have to connect to the world outside. But whereas descriptions connect to the outside world immediately in a one-to-one way, each description directly pertains to something outside, the immediate connections in the theoretical work are connections between parts of the theory itself. And often it's only the theoretical system as a whole, or at least some substantial cluster of that whole system, that is what connects to the outside world. So if you take a single term in isolation and search for real world examples, or you take a single proposition and ask how that sheds light on the outside world, you can end up quite frustrated. Well, actually, technically speaking, when we talk about use value, exchange value, and value, real world examples are all around us. The problem is they're obvious and trivial. So as our discussion proceeds, what we're talking about might seem dry and formal and without much real world importance. But my hope is that once all of the pieces are in place, we'll be better able to address whether and how our discussion is able to illuminate the world outside us. Another reason Capital doesn't speak directly to the reader is that it's a critique of political economy, which is its subtitle. And by by political economy, Marx means a body of thought. He doesn't mean a critique of the current economic order, although the book is that as well. So who Marx is speaking to most directly is not his reader, but the whole tradition of economic thought that preceded him. And because Capital is a critique of political economy, the topics the Capital deals with, the concepts and the terminology that Marx uses, and the argumentative structure of the book, none of those things are the results of free creative choices on Marx's part. And Capital isn't a self-contained theoretical system. The topics of the book, the terminology, the structure were constrained and largely determined by the preceding history of the political economy that Marx was criticizing. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. For the students who have the sheet of quotations, the quotation from Lenin leads them off. I'm just going to go through that sheet in order. So I won't at each time be saying, you got yourself a quote about this, but you'll just look at the sheet and you'll see when the next one comes. But the first one is from Lenin. He famously remarked that one can't fully understand Capital, especially the first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Hegel, the German philosopher who lived at least when Marx was young. So I think that Lenin's statement is a bit of an exaggeration, but I think it's basically right. You can't fully understand Capital without a real grounding in Hegel's logic. By the same token, one can't fully understand Capital, especially the first chapter, without some grounding in the tradition of political economy with which Marx is engaging. So in general, a business student who's taken a course in money and banking is initially going to understand chapter 3 on money somewhat better than a radical student who hasn't. A business student will at least have a sense of what Marx is talking about and why. Okay, so I want to then start the discussion of use value, exchange value, and value by engaging with pre-Marx economic theory, going all the way back to Aristotle. In his book Politics, Aristotle noted that shoes can be used in two ways. They can be worn and they can be exchanged for something else. And that was Aristotle's entry point into an argument which concluded that household management is necessary and honorable, while retail trade, and especially money lending, usury, that's unnatural and justly censured. So says Aristotle. In any case, the shoe example doesn't actually distinguish between value in use and value in exchange, but it does mark a distinction between an object being useful in the normal sense and an object being exchangeable. Adam Smith, 1776, seems to have been the first person to point out the distinction between what we're calling use value and exchange value, and Smith called value in use and value in exchange. He seems not to have had Aristotle in mind. What was going on is he was writing a passage in his book Wealth of Nations, and he was discussing how he would be focusing on value in exchange. And at that point, he made a passing remark about how the word value is commonly employed. Okay, and he wrote, quote, "The word value, it is to be observed, has two different meanings, and sometimes expresses the utility of some particular object, and sometimes the powers of purchasing other goods, which the possession of that object conveys. The one may be called value in use, the other value in exchange." And then Smith noted that things can have a lot of value in use, but not much value in exchange, like water, or the opposite, like diamonds. Smith did not do much with that distinction, but it was kept alive largely because about 40 years later, another classical political economist, David Ricardo, began his book, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. Right out, he begins by quoting and endorsing Smith's distinction. And then Ricardo drew a couple of inferences from an example similar to Smith's water diamond example. Ricardo's first inference was that utility is not the measure of exchangeable value, although it's absolutely essential to it. And the second inference was that provided that we are referring to commodities that possess utility, Ricardo said they derive their exchangeable value from other sources, not the utility. In any case, now that Ricardo had given the distinction between value in use and value in exchange a prominent place and a role in a systematic theoretical discussion, it stuck. The distinction became part of standard economics. And it remains a small part, but it remains a part of standard economics to this day. Okay, the only thing I want to say, apart from what I've already said about the pre-Marx history of these concepts, is that Louis Althusser, a French intellectual popular in the 1960s and 70s, Althusser was a supposed expert, but he was just shockingly ignorant of this history. In his preface to Volume 1 of Capital, a French edition, Althusser advised first-time readers of the book to, quote, put the whole of Part 1 aside for the time being. He said that was imperative. And among Althusser's main complaints was the fact that Part 1 retains what Althusser called traces of Hegelian influence. Again, Hegel. And what was Althusser's supposed evidence for this Hegelian influence? He says, quote, it can be located very precisely in the vocabulary Marx uses in Part 1, in the fact that he speaks of two completely different things, the social usefulness of products and the exchange value of the same products in terms which have a word in common, the word value, use value and exchange value. Marx, according to Althusser, should have eliminated the word value from the expression use value, should have just used the term social usefulness of the products. And then Althusser suggested that when Marx admitted to having flirted with modes of expression peculiar to Hegel, Marx was referring to the distinction between use value and exchange value. So said Althusser. So the abysmal state of Marx scholarship is nothing new. Althusser wrote this nonsense in 1969. And because he was considered quite the authority, it was published not in some obscure journal, but in a preface to Volume 1 of Capital. To understand the remainder of my talk this evening, we're going to move into Marx now. You're going to have to hold in mind the definitions of the terms value in use and value in exchange. These are definitions that Marx, as we've seen, inherited from classical political economy, not Hegel. And he employed the terms in Capital without modifying their meaning substantially. Okay, the definition of value in use, or use value. The definition is simple. It means utility or usefulness. The only catch here is that Marx didn't think that utility in general, abstract utility, was a viable concept. As he put it at the start of Capital, quote, usefulness does not dangle in midair. There are only different things that are useful in different ways, in Marx's view. So he typically referred to use values, plural. And because usefulness does not dangle in midair, but is instead, quote, conditioned by the physical properties of the commodity, Marx typically called the physical things themselves use values. So instead of saying that they have use value, he said that they are use values. Okay, the definition of value in exchange, also known as exchange value. It's also simple, or it would be, except for the fact that to grasp it, you may have to clear away a good deal of misinformation that you've heard. Okay, as Smith said, the term value in exchange expresses the power of purchasing other goods which the possession of that object conveys. That's a good definition. But a more complete definition has to specify how much power of purchasing the object conveys. So here goes. The exchange value of any item is the particular physical amount of a different item for which it can be exchanged. The exchange value of any item is the particular physical amount of a different item for which it can be exchanged. Okay, that's the definition, no more, no less, nothing different. So, examples that might help fix the concept. Imagine a sandwich can be exchanged for 2 cups of coffee. Then the exchange value of the sandwich in terms of cups of coffee is 2 cups. If a car can be exchanged for 600 barrels of crude oil, the car's exchange value in terms of crude oil is 600 barrels. And we have to say stuff like exchange value in terms of cups of coffee and in terms of crude oil, because sandwiches and cars are potentially exchangeable for lots of other things as well. And so sandwiches, cars, everything have lots of other exchange values. So the sandwich might be exchangeable for $4. Its exchange value in terms of dollars is $4. The car might be exchangeable for $25,000. So its exchange value in terms of dollars is $25,000. And thankfully, there's a shorthand term here, for exchange values in terms of money. We don't say exchange values in terms of money, we say price. The price of the sandwich is $4, the price of the car is $25,000. Okay, price is exchange value in terms of money. Okay, so I mentioned that Marx uses the term use values to refer to physical things themselves. And this isn't even an issue when it comes to exchange values. Commodities exchange values are by definition physical things. 2 cups of coffee, 600 barrels of crude oil, and so forth. So, although we often say that commodities have exchange value, there is no doubt that it's correct to say that they are exchange values of other commodities. And now we can come to Marx's innovation. Chapter 1 of Capital, it's on the commodity. And Marx begins by saying, our investigation begins with an analysis of the commodity. And that in itself is new. Previously, no one had thought that commodities were things that needed to be investigated, much less analyzed. Nowhere in classical political economy. Analyzed. Strictly speaking, analysis refers to breaking something down into its elements or separating them. It's the opposite of synthesis. And Marx begins the chapter at the start of Capital. He begins with the commodity already separated into elements. In the title of section 1, he says that there are 2 factors of the commodity, use value and value. Note that he writes use value and value, not use value and exchange value. And that in itself should signal that value here is not an abstract general term under which Marx is subsuming both use value and exchange value. Instead, Marx says that there are 2 factors or elements of commodities, and value is one of them. It's the one that's not use value. So already at this point, the standard opposition between use value and exchange value has begun to be crowded out, if not exactly replaced, by a somewhat similar but different opposition between use value and value. Marx begins to say a few things about use values, and he concludes that discussion by saying that in this society, the use values, the physical things that are useful, quote, are also the material bearers of exchange value. For example, a car is the material bearer of the exchange value of 600 barrels of crude oil. And then Marx launches into his innovation. And the innovation is his claim, and I would say his recognition of the fact that there's something underlying the relation between cars and crude oil, or sandwiches and coffee, or whatever it is. Indeed, it underlies the relation between any 2 exchange values. It's a third thing, value, third thing. Now, value isn't actually a thing. At least it's not a physical thing. And in the German text, Marx didn't say there's a third thing. He said that there's a third. But that's weird in English. So the word thing gets tacked on in English, third thing. In any case, Marx's point is that, quote, exchange value cannot be anything other than the mode of expression, the form of appearance of a content distinguishable from it, distinguishable from the exchange value. And on the next page, he gives the name value to what he here called the content. In other words, value is something distinguishable from exchange value, and value is what underlies exchange value. Exchange value is just the form in which value appears on the surface of society. Why was Marx concerned to make this distinction between exchange value and value? That's a big topic. I think there were multiple reasons. Technical reasons, political reasons, theoretical reasons, a lot of reasons. But I'm going to skip all of that. I'm also going to skip the proof, or at least sketch of a proof, that Marx provided to support his conclusion that exchange value is just the form of appearance of value. I'll skip it because it's rather involved and difficult. But I do want to give you a sense, at least, of the basic intuition behind Marx's proof or proof sketch. The intuition is this. You've got a car, you've got 600 barrels of crude oil. They're worth as much as one another. They're of equal worth. But for two things to be equal, or even for two things to be capable of being compared quantitatively at all, worth twice as much, worth 3 times as much, so forth, for that to be possible, they must be commensurable, have a common measure. In other words, they have to be things of the same kind. And what they have in common is that they are things of this kind. Okay, so philosophically, this kind is their ground, or substance, or content, or if you will, it's a third thing. But that thing word is problematic. Marx communicated this intuition pretty clearly in a passage he wrote in the early 1860s, several years before Capital was published. It became part of Theories of Surplus Value, published after his death. And in this passage, Marx was arguing against the notion that exchange value is merely a relation between two things with nothing underlying that relation. And he wrote, "If a thing is distant from another, the distance is a relation between the one thing and the other. But at the same time, the distance is something different from this relation between the two things. If we speak of the distance as a relation between two things, we presuppose something intrinsic, some property of the things themselves, which enables them to be distant from each other. What is the distance between the syllable ah and a table? I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. So in speaking of the distance of two things, we distinguish them as different points of space, and to belong to space is their unity. Okay? And the syllable ah doesn't have that property. So that's what makes that different. Okay, I want to share just a couple more things with you about the relationship in Capital between the concepts use value, exchange value, and value. And one is a comment that Marx made around 1880 in his notes on Wagner, not the composer. He was responding to the interpretation of Capital contained in an 1879 book by Adolf Wagner, who was a German economist at the time. So Marx takes something that Wagner wrote and responds, all this is drivel. In the first place, I do not proceed from concepts, hence neither from the concept of value, and am therefore in no way concerned to divide it. What I proceed from is the simplest social form in which the product of labor presents itself in contemporary society, and this is the commodity. This I analyze initially in the form in which it appears. Thus, I do not divide value into use value and exchange value as opposites into which the abstraction value splits up, but the concrete social form of the product of labor, the commodity, is on the one hand use value and on the other value. Not exchange value, since the mere form of appearance is not its own content. Okay, this passage indicates that Marx didn't agree that his text began with an abstract concept value that he divided into use value and exchange value. Instead, Marx says it began with something concrete, the commodity, which it analyzed. And the analysis revealed that the commodity itself is divided. It's a use value and it's a value, not a use value and an exchange value. And in the middle of this same passage, the same bit of response to Wagner, Marx called attention to a paragraph in chapter 1 of Capital in which he stressed the distinction between value and exchange value and clarified how they're related. In the Penguin edition, that paragraph is on page 152. And Marx says, when at the beginning of this chapter, we said in the customary manner that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value, this was strictly speaking wrong. A commodity is a use value or object of utility and a value. It appears as the twofold thing it really is as soon as its value possesses its own particular form of manifestation. This form of manifestation is exchange value, and the commodity has this form only when it is in an exchange relation with the second commodity. Once we know this, our manner of speaking does no harm It serves rather as an abbreviation. I guess Marx was right that it does no harm to say that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value once we know that that's not his actual theory. And once we know that the actual theory is that a commodity is both a use value and a value, while exchange value is merely a form of manifestation of value. The problem, though, is that the relations between these concepts are still to this day not things we all know. And because of that, using value to mean exchange value or vice versa, it can do a fair bit of harm. Okay, I think you might need to catch your breath. So to give you a chance to process all of this and make sure that we're all on the same page going forward, I want to take a few minutes and play What is Wrong with This Picture. So we'll read a few things written in encyclopedias, a glossary, a couple of books, and see if you can spot what's wrong with them. And for those who have the sheet of quotations, the first one is from Wikipedia. It's the entry for exchange value. Quote, Marx regards exchange value as the proportion in which one commodity is exchanged for other commodities. Actual money prices only roughly correspond to exchange values. The exchange value of a good is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce the commodity.
Andrew, can I just point out to everyone listening and watching that I put a link to the document, to the file with the quotes on it in the chat in case you didn't get it beforehand.
Great, great. So what is wrong with that? You might think you're inadequate because you don't see how these three definitions are the same, but the problem's not yours. The problem's an alleged encyclopedia that anyone can edit, and it shows. The first definition is correct. The problem is the second one contradicts it. The money price is the exchange value of the commodity in terms of money. It doesn't roughly correspond to the commodity's exchange value. It is the commodity's exchange value in terms of money. And then the third definition, determined by socially necessary labor time, that refers to Marx's theory of how the magnitude of commodities' values are determined. Values, not exchange values. Neither Marx nor anyone else has ever thought that the proportion in which one commodity is exchanged for other commodities is determined exclusively by the amount of labor needed to produce it. Nobody has ever thought that. Okay, second example is from a more reputable encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia of Consumer Culture. Matthias Varul wrote the entry for value, exchange, and use value. And he began by saying, quote, for Marx, the value of a commodity has two necessary but contradictory aspects, use value and exchange value. Okay, the problem here is that the author has done a Herr Wagner. He's alleging that Marx divided value into use value and exchange value, okay? In other words, he's saying that the abstraction value splits up into two opposites, okay? For Marx, what has contradictory aspects isn't value, it's the commodity, and value is one of the commodity's two contradictory aspects, the other being use value. Third, this is from the popular Marxists Internet Archive. They have a glossary, and the entry in the glossary for exchange value says that it is the quantitative aspect of value as opposed to use value, which is the qualitative aspect of value. Value is often used as a synonym for exchange value, though strictly speaking, value indicates the concept which incorporates both quantity and quality. The problem here is the same problem. It's Herr Wagner's problem, thinking that Marx is splitting value into two things, you know, plain and peanut. No. Okay, the fourth example comes from Duncan Foley. He's a prominent economist at the New School in New York. He wrote a book, Understanding Capital, meaning Marx's Capital. And Foley wrote that, quote, the commodity can be exchanged for other commodities, This characteristic of exchangeability Marx calls value. It's important to understand that Marx views value as a substance contained in definite quantities in every commodity. Okay, a couple of problems with that. Actually, what Marx calls value is not the characteristic of exchangeability. He pointed out that some things that are exchangeable, like land or securities, stocks and bonds, aren't commodities, don't have value. What Marx called value was the content common to all commodities, as we saw. But the bigger problem, I think, is Foley saying that Marx views this characteristic, Marx views, according to Foley, this characteristic of exchangeability as a substance contained in definite quantities in every commodity. What can that possibly mean? That exchangeability is a substance contained in commodities in definite quantities. Okay, the final case, fifth and final, is somewhat more difficult, so it's extra credit. It's from the book Marxist Economic Theory by Ernest Mandel, who was also the author of the introduction to the Penguin edition of Capital. And he wrote a lot in that book, but one thing he wrote was, quote, "Money is a commodity in the value of which all other commodities express their own exchange value." Okay, a couple of problems here. First of all, exchange value, as Marx understood it, it is the form of appearance of value. So it's the form in which commodities' values are expressed. So Mandel should have said all other commodities express their own values, not express their own exchange value, which is an expression of value. But there's a bigger problem here. Okay, Mandel says that other commodities express exchange value in the value of money. But that's not right. What expresses their values is the money itself, the physical body of the money, not the value of the money. If gold were money, for instance, a car might be exchangeable for 13 ounces of gold. And what would we say? We would say that the car is worth 13 ounces of gold, or that its value is 13 ounces of gold. Particular amount of a physical thing. We wouldn't say that the car is worth the value of 13 ounces of gold, or that its value is the value of 13 ounces of gold. But literally, that's what Mandel is telling us. Okay, I want to turn now to one important implication of Marx's innovation, which will lead into a discussion of the fetishism of commodities. Earlier, I said that Marx transformed the key polarity, which had been between use value and exchange value. Marx made the key polarity use value and value. How did he make this transformation? I think the answer is that, in contrast to Smith and Ricardo, Marx is no longer analyzing the word value or the concept of value. And that's what he was emphasizing in response to Herr Wagner. Marx is analyzing commodities. And commodities aren't abstract, universal terms. They aren't terms at all. Commodities are particular, concrete, physical objects that we find all around us. And by analyzing commodities, Marx concludes that they are, on the one hand, physical objects that have distinct properties that make them useful in distinct ways. On the other hand, all commodities have a shared, non-physical, and therefore purely social property. Every commodity has value. Indeed, every commodity is a value, or perhaps it's clearer to say that it's a material bearer or carrier of value. If you are walking around with a diamond on your finger, you're carrying around value, not just a useful object. And by the way, you're not carrying around the diamond's exchange value, since the diamond's exchange value is some amount of a different item, money, crude oil, cars. So Marx is telling us that these physical objects, commodities, we find them all around us, but they have a dual character. They're not simple. They're complex, composite, and they're internally divided. As use values, commodities are diverse, physical, useful things. As values, they're just the opposite, homogeneous, non-physical, and thus exclusively social figures, and without useful properties. Inasmuch as commodities are the elementary forms of all wealth in capitalist society, and wealth is so central to capitalist society, this duality and internal division are all pervasive. As the Marxist-Humanist philosopher Raya Dunayevskaya put it, quote, "There is nothing simple about a commodity. It is from the start a unity of opposites, use value and value, which in embryo contains all the contradictions of capitalism." We said that use values are the physical or material side of commodities, while value is the immaterial, purely social side. This same internal division holds true regarding many important relations within capitalist society. For example, relations of production, capitalist relations of production. Consider from one side their material or physical relations, particular kinds of use values, workers' labor power, means of production, machines, raw materials, they combine to produce use values. That's the material side of capitalist production. But in this society, the means of production, raw materials, machines, and so forth, they're also values. And Marx argues that workers' labor not only produces use values, but also creates value. So capitalist production is also the production of value and surplus value. That's its social side. As far as I know, Marx didn't explicitly draw attention to this dialectic of material and social as a theme of capital, but I think it's prominent throughout the book. Again and again, Marx contrasts the material character of things to their social character, the use value side to the value side. Why did he do this? Why did he do this? I think the key reason is that he was a revolutionary. He wanted to help change the world. And the issue any thoughtful revolutionary faces the following question: what can be changed? What cannot be changed? Marx's view of this was, roughly speaking, that material relations and entities are natural, present in all societies, and can't be changed. But social entities and relations are specific to particular societies, and they are capable of being changed. He wrote in a letter to a friend, Dr. Ludwig Kugelmann, this necessity of the distribution of social labor in specific proportions is certainly not abolished by the specific form of social production. It can only change its form of manifestation. Natural laws cannot be abolished at all. The only thing that can change is the form in which those laws assert themselves. Okay, so you have to separate out the material side from the social side. That might actually seem to be pretty easy, but Marx treated it as a difficult and tricky problem. One thing that makes it tricky is that in capitalist society, the things that have social properties are also material things. And relations that are social are also material. Commodities, for example, they're material things, but they have a purely social property. They're values. But there's something in addition that makes it even trickier to separate out the material from the social. It's that the things and relations that have social properties seem to have these social properties because of their particular material properties. Back when Marx was writing, the gold standard prevailed, and gold was not infrequently treated as if it were value itself, value incarnate. In other words, gold was treated as if it had value immediately because it's gold, for crying out loud. It's got value, right? In contrast, all other commodities seem to possess value only indirectly, reflectively by being exchangeable for gold, which was the thing that was value itself. That was a common way of thinking. Now, let's think about what that would mean if things and relations that have social properties really did have them because of their material properties. Imagine, for instance, that products of labor are values or have value just because they're produced by labor. It's just in the nature of labor to produce value. Imagine if that were the case. Or imagine that relations of production are value relations because it's an inherent characteristic of material production to create value. What would that mean? I think it would suggest that value and value production are natural and cannot be done away with. And that's a conclusion that Marx, as a revolutionary, was at pains to combat. His theory of the fetishism of the commodity and of more developed forms of that fetishism is partly about this issue of things seeming to have social properties because of their material properties. In section 4 of chapter 1 of Capital, Marx posed the question, whence arises the enigmatic character of the product of labor as soon as it assumes the form of a commodity? Clearly it arises from this form itself, the twofold character of the commodity. The commodity reflects social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of products of labor, as socio-natural properties of things. Hence, it reflects the social relations of producers as a social relation between objects, which exists apart from and outside the producers. That isn't the easiest passage to explicate. It's quite hard. But part of what Marx was getting at, I think, is that the commodity form itself makes the historically specific social side of commodities and commodity relations seem to be natural and immutable, incapable of being changed. Social properties seem to be socio-natural properties because commodities are natural things that have social properties, such as value. And because commodities are indeed natural things, they seem naturally to have these social properties. There's a somewhat similar passage near the end of volume 3 of Capital. In this passage, Marx was excoriating the idea that capital generates interest, income, or profit, and that land generates rent because it's in the nature of the physical means of production in land to generate those kinds of income. He wrote that this completes the reification, thingification of social relations and the immediate coalescence of material relations of production with their historical and social specificity. Mr. Capital and Mrs. Land act as, at the same time, social characters and mere things. This expression, at the same time, social characters and mere things, kind of puts in a nutshell the conflation of what's natural and what's social and how bizarre that is. But there's one more important dimension, I think, of Marx's theory of the fetishism of the commodity as well. And Marx alludes to that when he refers to this social relation between objects which exists apart from and outside the producers. Commodities and capital aren't just physical things that have social properties. They're things that human beings have produced, but which have social power, their own social power, detached from the people who produced them, alienated from the people who produced them. Indeed, they have power over their producers. And this is why Marx uses the term fetish here. The situation is, in one sense, much like a totem pole that people have carved, and it has supernatural power because people endow it with supernatural power. Or shoes. Somebody has produced shoes, and they have sexual power because a shoe fetishist endows them with sexual power. Marx's own favorite analogy was to religion, and he said in religion, the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with a life of their own. They enter into relations both with each other and with the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. Okay? But there's a crucial difference between religion and commodities here. And it has important political implications, I think. When the products of the human brain are endowed with a life of their own, that's an illusion or a delusion, it can be overcome through correct thinking. But when products of men's hands are endowed with a life of their own, the cause is not ideological error. At least Marx didn't think it was. Later in volume 1 of Capital, he argued that workers' wages will never rise to levels that threaten the continuation of capitalism because once they begin to rise, counteracting mechanisms kick in. And Marx concluded that discussion by writing, just as man is governed in religion by the products of his own brain, so in capitalist production, he is governed by the products of his own hand. Marx was saying that workers really are governed by the products of their hands. This situation can't be overcome just by thinking about it differently. For example, you can know perfectly well that insofar as its physical side is concerned, capital is just machines and raw materials and so on, so forth. But that knowledge doesn't do anything to eliminate capital's social power. And that is a power that's great enough to kill you if you can't get a job that allows you to work with the machines and materials and produce products for capitalists. The reason that knowledge doesn't eliminate the social power of capital is that capital's power is objective. It's not an illusion. It's not produced in your brain. So we're not trapped by false consciousness here. We're trapped in this society. Thus, current social relations can't possibly be overcome just by dispelling illusions. There needs to be objective, revolutionary transformation of those social relations. Thank you very much.
Wow, this would be the time where there would be huge applause. I like to, in memory of a different kind of sociality, people are putting up their pictures of clapping. It doesn't quite do the same thing, but we appreciate your talk, a real talk, a coherent talk, and I think gets to the heart of those people who think of capital in particular as a kind of scriptural text that has a letter that needs to be believed in and gone through and read over and over again. I'm among those people. I think students in the seminar are also. So I really appreciate the care, the precision of the thinking. We're going to start asking the students if they have questions. I want to start off with a question for you. I'm intrigued, first of all, by the gesture of pushing Hegel away. I do think you're right that certainly that Althusser didn't know what he was talking about, and that value doesn't come from Hegel, and that distinction doesn't come from Hegel. That's true. But a lot of the other things you were talking about come directly from idealism. Ground, for example, the question of the form of appearance of something. So to get into a little bit of that vocabulary, because it is necessary for understanding what Marx is doing with value. I think you made that clear. It's not only that social and economic relations are expressed here or need something like value in order to work in this particular form of society, but he's drawing on an idealist vocabulary in order to say also how they work. So I wanted to ask you this, and I also appreciate really tremendously the, I want to call it pessimism of your reading. I think Marx is a really severe pessimist. Paul and I think both agree that he didn't think consciousness raising or the removal of illusions would get you anywhere. By this point, he certainly didn't think that. That a change in material conditions or a change in the mechanism. So I want to get at that issue you brought up, where I think you said something like value and value relations are probably on the natural side, not on the side that can be changed. And I'm pretty convinced that Marx didn't believe that. I'm not sure that and that his arguments are towards another reading. Not that he could tell you exactly how that could be changed. But let me ask you this. Where is value? It's a ground. It's not in the physical things as a physical characteristic. it's not something that can be sensed directly. It belongs to those things that Marx called sensible supersensibles. Where is it? How can it be part of material conditions if it has that strange characteristic that a lot of other metaphysical moments had, which were okay in Hegel? They took a different form in Hegel. Actually, they weren't metaphysical. They weren't only metaphysical. They were also inscribed in social institutions for Hegel as well. But so my question is something like, well, isn't he also saying this value thing is is the metaphysics of capitalism? Can't we get rid of it?
Would now be a good time for me to respond?
If you feel like it.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much for your very perceptive and kind, perceptive and kind remarks, Paul. First, I realized that it might seem that I was trying to push Hegel away and to deny that there were traces of Hegelianism in Capital. No, I think completely the opposite. I mean, Marx is a dyed-in-the-wool Hegelian German idealist, which is different from other kinds of idealism. I have no doubt. I was just saying that where Althusser tried to locate the Hegelianism was in Smith and Ricardo Classical Political Economy, and that coquetting with modes of expression peculiar to Hegel wasn't saying use value. So there is a Hegelian inheritance, and I think it's more than flirtation. And yes, there were clear signs of that in my talk today. All I meant to say is that Althusser's understanding and the evidence that he brought forward were just not right. I went quickly, so I did not mean to say, I hope I did not say, that value and value relations fall on the natural or material side. Quite the opposite. Use value, that's the natural physical side. Value, nothing natural, nothing physical about it whatsoever. The existence of commodities as values is purely social. There are other societies in which things are useful, but they don't have value, they aren't values, and so forth. And Marx is pretty clear about that as well. So I don't think Marx is pessimistic. I don't think he says that this can't be done away with. You know, a few years after writing the second German edition, which is basically the translation of which we're reading, a few years later, he criticizes the Gotha program. And he says in communist society, the producers do not exchange their products. Neither does the labor that they put in to producing the products appear as the value of these products as a material quality possessed by them in communist society, because in contrast to capitalist society, workers' work relations, their relations will be directly social, which they're not in capitalism. So Marx was under no belief that value relations were eternal, transhistorical, had to exist in the future. One can argue with that, but I don't think that was Marx's point of view. Value, where is it? That's the interesting thing. A lot of things I think are real, that you can't locate their existence because they're not things. They're part of understanding the structuring of things. For instance, causality. It means show me a cause, right? Right? You can't. This is the problem that David Hume raised, right? You can show me this comes before that. You can't show me cause. But causality is a category that we use to refer not to things themselves, but to the structuring of things. And so you could say value is part of the structure of what things are in a commodity producing society, you know, basically capitalism.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, let's take this moment to ask students if they want to post questions. This sometimes takes a minute. I could start while they're posting with a question that was sent in advance. Let's see if I can find it. Right. Okay, so here's a question. Well, I'm going to hold that for a minute because doesn't pertain directly to this question of value. Could we, while students prepare questions, could we go to Enrique Wellen and unmute them so they can ask their question? Audrey? He's unmuted.
Yes. Hello, thanks for your lecture. It was very informative. Yes, I wrote that is because I want you, if possible, to talk a little bit more about the relationship of the form and the content of the value. Because sometimes it appears like it's, for one side, it's impossible in an empirical way to find what exactly is the value. And in the content, it's possible because it's the time of the label, the social necessary label time. But in the form, in the relationship of the value, like a metaphysics things, sometimes in the capital, it appears like a force that's impossible to overcome. So I suppose I would like you to comment, to analyze this. Okay, thank you.
Could you elaborate a little? I kind of didn't quite understand it.
Yes, just to analyze the relationship between the form and the content of the value. The difference between the content of the value and the relation of the labor time, right, and the relationship in the society. Like
okay. Right, okay. So you mean, for instance, the difference between value and form of value?
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay, right. It's kind of tricky because Marx uses the term value form in two entirely different ways. He refers to the value form of the product of labor. That means, like, in specific societies that produce commodities, above all capitalism, the product of labor has a value form. Things that people produce are not only use values, they are also value. So that's the value form of the product of labor. Then in an entirely different way, he uses the same term, value form or form of value, to mean the form of appearance of value. In other words, exchange value. Okay? And the most highly developed form of appearance of value, or the most highly developed form of appearance, exchange value, is where all of the commodities seem to just be use values and not to have value unto themselves, except one. There's one excluded commodity that is privileged, and it seems to be exchange value. It seems to have value by its own physical nature, okay? And that's money. And this is what Marx is doing in section 3 of chapter 1. He's saying, look, every commodity is, on the one hand, use value, on the other hand, it's value. Each commodity's value appears as being worth something else. That's its exchange value. And that polarity develops. It develops historically, but he also develops it conceptually. And he says, okay, so the commodity has this and that and the other thing. It's exchangeable with all of these other things, so it has a myriad of exchange values. And then he flips it around and he says, all of these things, okay, they can be exchanged for this one thing. and then, you know, you put the stamp with the Queen's head on it, and that one thing becomes money. So there's a long kind of polemical history to what he's arguing there, but that is where he most rigorously and at length tries to work out how it is in fact that every commodity is in itself value, but it appears on the surface of society that this one commodity, gold, is value. And he's at pains to argue that it's not money which makes other commodities valuable. They are valuable unto themselves. They have value, not use value, value in the society. And by virtue of that, the commodity can fulfill this function of expressing, the money can fulfill this function of expressing their value. This was a very live issue for Marx because he was at pains to combat people like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Darimon, who were interested in monetary reform and who thought that, you know, what you needed was just to change monetary relations so that you could redistribute incomes, and that would solve all the ills of capitalist production. And Marx is saying, no, 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 no. You know, the problem goes to the existence of commodities and to, you know, the commodity form of the product of labor, the value form of the product of labor. You try to change the exchange relations, but keep commodity and commodity production intact. All of these things are just going to arise again. As long as you've got commodities, you have to have exchange. You have to have the independence of the product from the producers, the value of the product being independent of what, you know, people decide or want. There's something objective there. So there's a real live political, polemical context to all of that for Marx. But if you read the third section of the third section of chapter 1 with care, you get, I think, the actual theory laid out there, and then it's supplemented by a few remarks in chapter 2 and chapter 3.
Andrew, I want to jump in there and ask a couple of clarifying questions about value. We're used to thinking of value, even in an everyday way, as having a subject, that something is valuable to someone, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Marx is moving far away from this, it seems. Obviously, use value is to someone, someone very particular. And then when you read Capital, or you read the rumors about capital, you think, okay, well, value is not to someone, it is made out of the labor put into it, which has been homogenized and averaged and counted in terms of time. You said no one has ever thought that exchange value or the price of a commodity is fully determined by the socially necessary labor put into it. That makes sense to me, but what's the other component?
In other words,
where does the socially necessary labor, where does the labor in the labor theory of value fit into your reading?
Okay. So I think what we're addressing is what is the relationship between the value of commodities and the price of commodities? Is that correct?
I was thinking of value, trying to get towards the meaning of value in Capital. It seems like in your presentation, let's say labor and socially necessary or socially average labor time didn't come up at all. So where does that fit in your reading? A lot of the arguments against this theory of value have been against the idea that labor is the sole determinant of value.
Right. Okay. There are three issues going on there in the initial section of Capital. There's the substance of value, and there's the magnitude of value, and then there's this form of value. Marx says, in the third section, we'll get to the form of value. We've looked at he begins by talking about the substance of value. And that's what I was focused on in my remarks. Very little about the magnitude of value, which means how much value something has. And those are two basically distinct discussions. Or putting it more precisely, the magnitude rests on the discussion of substance, because it's a question of the kind of thing something is. Okay, so, Marx says that as values, these are products of labor. Then he says, how much? And then he says that the magnitude of a commodity's value, assuming that it is a commodity, something that does have use value or is a use value, given that fact, the magnitude of its value is exclusively determined by the amount of labor that's socially necessary to produce it. Okay, that's the theory. Now, the problem is that the price of a commodity is not exclusively determined by the amount of labor needed to produce it. So what you get much more sharply in Marx than in Smith or Ricardo is this distinction between the magnitude of price and the magnitude of value. Okay, I mean, he says value is determined, first of all, by the amount of labor. So it's not really an amount of labor, it's a monetary amount, to make it simple, a monetary amount that depends only on the amount of labor needed to produce it. And the price is a different, potentially different, and usually different monetary amount. And price is just more complexly determined. It depends on many, many other things beside the amount of labor needed to produce it. Temporary variations between supplies and demands, the tendency for rates of profit to equalize, so that no matter, you got an industry that doesn't use a lot of labor, like chemical production, you get another industry like bakery products that uses a lot of labor, relatively speaking. Well, the owners of those different kinds of business don't tend to get different rates of profit. They don't tend to realize different amounts of value because one uses a lot of labor, one doesn't. The rates of profit, the returns tend to equalize. So that's a systematic distortion wherein the prices differ from the values. And then you get to like, okay, so what the hell good is this value stuff if you're saying, well, we got these prices out there on the surfaces of society and they're different from the values, well, these things express values. Well, if they're just different, how do they express value? So this is what Marx gets to in volume 3 in particular. He says, yeah, in each individual case, in this industry, that industry, the amounts of value that are produced are different from the amounts of value received. The amounts of surplus value produced are different from the amounts of surplus value received, but it all works out in the wash. Okay, you look at the total social capital, the whole society, the total price of all the commodities equals the total value, the total surplus, the total profit equals the total surplus value. That's his argument. So it's a law, that he states at the start of Capital, a principle, magnitude of value determined by labor time. It doesn't seem to have any real world purchase once you get to this deviation of value, price from value, but then he comes back to it and says, you look at the totality and nothing's really changed. That's his argument.
Okay, thank you. I'm processing all of this and we'll be processing it for some time, so I appreciate it.
Well, speaking of that, I know this stuff is hard, especially, when you can't read it. I mean, I get very little just through my ears. I'm going to make available the text of my remarks. so
Oh,
that
that's
everybody
terrific.
can read that.
Great, and we'll distribute it. Let's turn to, now I have a question from Philip Wohlstetter, but I wonder if Philip could make the question a little bit clearer. I'm not exactly sure what's at stake there. So Philip, if you want to put it in again, a little bit clearer, we'll come to you. We have a question from Shyam Sundar, or Shyam. Can we unmute?
Hello. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
welcome.
It seems to me that is labor then the cost of a commodity? And did Marx deal with the problems of measurement of value? Your remarks, wonderful remarks, were mostly concerned, of course, with the concepts of value. In numerical forms can deviate quite significantly due to various problems. Did Marx concern himself with the measurement problems associated with various concepts of value?
What do you think, Andrew? The question is.
I mean, I think he very much did. I mean, not in terms of empirical measurement. They didn't live in a world in which there were a lot of data. Marx was a real data hound, but there just weren't a lot of data. And he was an avid reader of The Economist, for instance. But issues of measurement were really kind of uppermost in his mind. And that's the context in which he works out this intuition that underlying exchange value is this commonality that allows these things to be equal or quantitatively comparable, that commonality being value. And this whole topic began as a question of measurement of value in classical political economy. Because if you think of value just as a relation between things or commodities, you run into this problem. One moment, a coat exchanges for such and such amount of gold. And then it exchanges for less gold. Well, which thing has had a change in its value, the coat or the gold? And people like Ricardo wanted to be able to nail down the source of the change in value. Is it the coat's value that's changed, or is it the gold's value that's changed? And there was an opponent of all of this stuff named Samuel Bailey, and he said, this is just nuts. Value is just a relation between things. So you can't say that the value of the coat went up or down, the value of the gold went up or down. It doesn't have any meaning. Value is a relation between things right now, and it's just a relation that changed. And Marx is saying, oh my God, this guy, he really found a hole in Ricardian theory, and he's pulling it and stretching it and making it bigger. And the whole concept of value and the whole theory of value, they got to be rescued. And Ricardo and those guys, they're long dead. I got to do it. So he begins to do this. And this is pretty late in the day. This is the early 1860s that he works a lot of this stuff out. So, to some extent, this is at the root of measurement issue. But to your other question, is labor the cost of the commodity? Yes. In Marx's view, the real cost of a commodity is determined strictly by the amount of labor that goes into it. But then he says the cost to the capitalist is a smaller amount because the capitalists pay for only I got to be careful here. He talks about unpaid labor and paid labor. So the cost to the capitalist is just the cost of the means of production and the wages of the workers, and the labor that is added as surplus labor for which no equivalent is paid, that portion of the cost is not borne by the capitalists. But Marx regards it as part of the full cost of the commodity. Okay, so in other words, that's at some level the cost that the purchasers bear, but the capitalist does not bear it, and then that you get a difference, and that's where the profit is involved.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going through the chat here, and we'd like to turn now to Vanessa Arapko. Can we unmute Vanessa?
Oh my God. Hello.
You're on, Vanessa. Do you want to read yours out?
I was hoping you wouldn't unmute me. Thank you for a wonderful talk. It was great. My main question is, how would you situate your work and your reading of Marx in relation to value form theory, like in Notes and Chris Arthur and those sorts of people?
Right. Well, Marx was a value form theorist in a very precise sense of that. He wrote about the form of value, the value form of the product of labor, and the form that value takes as exchange value. Value form is really his term. But there is this modern tradition, Chris Arthur, Heinrich, Patrick Murray, which argues that commodities don't have value or only have potential value prior to sale, and that it's only when something is sold that it actually acquires actual value. This is the antithesis. This is the antithesis of Marx's view. And I wrote a paper on that, and that's on the website of the Journal Critique of Political Economy. In this podcast that Brendan Cooney and I co-host, we've had a couple of episodes where the paper that I wrote got responded to by one of these value form theorists, Patrick Murray. And in 2 episodes, I commented along with Brendan and responded to Murray. And then in another 2 episodes of Radio Free Humanity, Patrick Murray came on. And we had a discussion with Patrick Murray, myself, and Brendan Cooney. So if you're interested in learning more, you can listen to all, I don't know, several hours of this. But I just think it's absolutely clear that when you make enough distinctions, the whole necessary distinctions, and they're in Marx, and they reflect real distinctions in reality. When you make the necessary distinctions, what seems to be the case for this idea that commodities get their value only if they're sold, it just falls apart. And the case for that is really people conflating a bunch of things without making all the needed distinctions. That's my view.
Okay, thanks. I want to move through the chat. Gabriel Cabrera has a question. Gabriel, do you want to ask your question? You can unmute. If, by the way, you want me to read the question, just note that in the chat. That's
Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, just one moment, okay? I'm just looking for the question for me to read it properly.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, hello. Well, my question is, first of all, regarding the specificity of the labor power, right? So there's a debate, I believe, and there's people who consider it a commodity, and people who doesn't consider it a commodity, but rather something else that behaves like a commodity. So I would like to know what Andrew thinks about that, and what are the theoretical implications of that? Also, because there's a current debate now, at least within Latin American Marxists, if Marx has a labor theory of value or he hasn't. If possible, right? I have another small question that is, could Marx's law of value be applied to the economic analysis of pre-capitalist societies, or will that lead us to a formalist approach rather than a substantivist one? Thank you.
Well, my view is that, I mean, Marx clearly intended the concept of value to apply only to where you've got commodities, and generally speaking, only commodity production. And the only society that really has generalized commodity production is capitalist society. And I mean, you just look at, like, for instance, chapter 1 of Capital, he goes through a variety of other societies, and he talks about, you know, independent peasants producing, and he talks about future communist society and Robinson Crusoe's one-person society. There are direct social relations between people and their work. So you don't have commodities, you don't have value, and so forth. I'm not really aware of this debate in Latin American Marxism that you're familiar with, that you're referring to. I'm not familiar with it. So I would want to understand the argument that labor power is not a commodity, but acts like a commodity. I could comment on it if I understood what the claim was.
Maybe we can put that to a potential email that he could write to you.
Sure.
And you could work that out. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, I know that for decades, people have always, you know, had some problems with this because unlike most commodities are produced for the purpose of being exchanged. Labor power is not produced for the purpose of being exchanged. I mean, it's just people have the ability to work, which is labor power, by virtue of being born and you know, raised and so forth. So there's a difference between that commodity and other commodities. Is it big enough to say it's not a commodity? What are the implications of that? I have no real clue.
Okay, Paul Reiter, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for the talk. Very, very interesting. Lots to think about. And I want to pick up on something that you addressed early on in your talk, and I'm glad you did, because it's been very much on my mind, which is how this book, Capital, lends itself to what might be understood to be misreadings. And you pointed to some factors. Value, of course, is an area where, as we've been saying, there are a lot of different views, and you seem to think that some of them are, you know, just simply wrong. And so we should probably ask, well, you know, why is that? Why does it lend itself to this? And there are lots of reasons people come to the text, obviously, with all kinds of agendas. This is a question that I'm, in a way, recycling. I asked it last week. As I said, it's been on my mind, so I apologize for recycling the question. But you obviously thought about this in very, very intricate ways. And you know, one of the things that I find really fascinating about Marx's descriptions of value, definitions of value, is the way in which he reaches for different kinds of language, uses different kinds of language, reaches at times for, you know, fairly extravagant terms. In the 1867 version of the book, there's this idea of a fantastisches Gedankending, and then he talks in the 1872 version of gespenstige Gegenständlichkeit. He seems to be very interested at times in imagining value as a kind of impossible thing that's not a physical thing, but behaves in some ways like a thing. And so I'd be really curious to to hear your thoughts on this.
Could you repeat the last part? My thoughts on
this this issue of Marx's mode of expression in talking about value, and the way in which that might be a cause of, in his very attempts to clarify, which is clearly something that he struggles with. I mean, if you look at where there's what might be conventionally viewed as literary language in Capital, it does kind of cluster around value, his different descriptions of value. He does talk at times, again, about in the 1872 version as well, he doesn't talk about a fantastisches Gedankending, value being that, but he does talk at times about a Wertding. And so you could, say that people might be forgiven for thinking at times that even though Marx at some points says very clearly that value is not a physical thing, that maybe it is sort of has something to do with physical properties. So that's what I'm hoping to get your thoughts on.
Right. First of all, I would never want to subscribe to the view that certain conceptions of value, certain uses of the word value are wrong. I mean, Marx does not have a monopoly on the term.
No. I'm not talking about other interpretations.
Right, I understand.
I'm talking about readings of his interpretation.
Right. So it's not a question of it being right or wrong, but of a claim that this is how Marx used it, whether that claim that this is how he used it being correct or incorrect. And I mean, my view is that there's a lot of textual evidence and that there are norms and criteria for interpretation, and that the issue is potentially decidable in the normal way. Any empirical question is decidable because texts are empirical evidence. So I wanted to make clear that this is not about, some dogmatism. I know that's not what you're saying, but I want to make it clear to everybody. It's not about some dogmatism that, we own the concept and nobody else is allowed to use it their way. I mean, it's the term, okay? Marx had a lot of trouble getting his terminology straight, and particularly in the case of this distinction between exchange value and value. You might remember a few moments ago, I was talking about this issue of Ricardo and Bailey, and you got the code and you got the gold, and which one has the increase in value or the decrease in value? Is it on the side of the gold that its value changes or the side of the coat? And Bailey says, no, this is just nuts. And Marx says, whoa, I got to patch up all the holes in this. Okay. Marx had written a lot of stuff, including the Grundrisse, the contribution to the critique of political economy, before engaging with Bailey. So all of the innovation occurs in the 1860s. And the terminology, 1860s and thereafter, all of the terminological changes and precising of things occurs then. So if you look at Marx's texts, you have to grapple with a terminology that's changing and is not homogeneous, and it continues to change. There are differences between the first German edition and the second German edition with respect to even some of these issues about what does he mean by exchange value, what does he mean by value. So when he says, once we know this, the exchange value is just a form of appearance, and the real opposition is between use value and value, it does no harm to say, exchange value rather than value. I think he might have been covering his butt saying, maybe I didn't find every last place where I said exchange value when I meant value and vice versa. So let me just clarify it and say, yeah, there's no harm, once you understand this. So I think in the main, the concepts that he was trying to get across with at least these distinctions, the concepts he was trying to get across, I think they were fairly clear in his mind, and that the relationship between the concepts did not really change, but the terminology that he used did change, and that can clearly cause a lot of confusion. So what that requires is attention to which text he's talking about, understanding the whole history of this, and a concern to get Marx right, to get the author right.
Nice.
Okay, we're working on down through the questions in the chat. I think we'll take a couple more and then we'll draw to a close. There's a question from Alan Spanotto. Do you want to be unmuted and ask this original question?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering if in sort of modern economic data sets like, government labor statistics or anything like, or not necessarily labor, but just statistics and whatnot, is there anything that we could point to and say, aha, that is tracking value, that's measuring value? Is that even feasible at all?
I think it's feasible if you're not trying to be really picayune, if you're content with proxies that give you reasonable answers to certain questions. I've tried to do that in my book, The Failure of Capitalist Production, Underlying Causes of the Great Recession. We have in the United States, for instance, in most countries, we've got very good statistics on, how much work is done in this industry, that industry, on an annual basis. So there's other things that can be done to kind of quantify, to measure the quantities of value produced and so forth. It's not easy. There's no particular statistic in the government national accounts where you could say this is the one that gives it to you. You got to do some work, but I think it can be done if you're again concerned to get answers that are illuminating rather than to think that you're measuring things down to the second decimal point.
I am in fact not going chronologically in order of the questions in the chat, but I'm trying to keep closer to the question of the talk, the question of value. So I'm going to those questions first. And we have two, I believe, here, right? No, I just see one. So this is James's question. James Mossman, do you want to unmute?
Hello, thank you for your great talk. I think you did cover this maybe, but I'm a little bit confused. So I'm going to try to ask this question again, which is this distinction between price and value. And I think you explained that in the aggregate level, there is an equivalence, but I'm confused about at the micro level, you mentioned that there are issues of supply and demand and deviations, et cetera, that causes a distinction between price and value. But if I'm a capitalist or an entrepreneur, I'm operating at that local level, that micro level, and my decisions of how to behave and what to produce are set by those prices and whatever the upper bound of the rate of return I can expect. And presumably the aggregate activity of the country is, the sum of all these decisions. And so how would this change? And each of those decisions are a function of price, and we already say that's linked from value. But it seems like we don't need the concept of value to get what the aggregate sum is going to be. So like if we just drop the concept of value, how would we get a different result? How would we get a different sum of all these individual micro decisions? I don't know if that's clear or not, but.
Right, it's pretty clear. First of all, there's actually two distinctions between price and value. One, this quantitative distinction between, what the magnitude of a commodity's price is and the magnitude of its value. There's a different distinction between price and value, which is the one that I was focused on in my remarks earlier today, which is the qualitative distinction, one could call it. That price, like any other exchange value, is a form of appearance of value. Those are two different distinctions. So when one reads Marx, one has to be clear as to, when he says price, which price is he talking about? Form of appearance of value or a particular magnitude. But I wouldn't agree that in Marx's view, from the perspective of his theory, that prices become totally detached or decoupled from value. At the level of, yes, an individual firm's product, individual industry's product, there's always differences. And you're absolutely correct that firms, capitalists, investors, they don't make decisions based on any knowledge of value. They make decisions based on the monetary signals, the price signals that they get. But the production of value and the value relations govern all of this in Marx's view, and I think he's pretty right here. For instance, if value is not governing the whole kit and caboodle, why can't the sum of prices just be double, triple, quadruple, 1,000 times the quantities of value? And accordingly, if the prices, all just go sky high without any tethering to values, why can't the rate of profit, be 10 times what it is, 100 times what it is, 1,000 times what it is? So it means something to say that even though the quantities at the level of a particular firm or industry, the prices differ from the values produced, the amount of profit differs from the amount of surplus value produced. At the level of the social totality, the sum of prices is equal to the sum of values, and the sum of profits is equal to the sum of surplus values. Okay, that has a certain meaning. And it's very hard to get into this because there are issues of inflation principally, whereby it looks like, you can just inflate your way to prosperity. You just pump up the prices, you pump up the profits. But I mean, that's actually not right, okay? Because when you're inflating things, you're just raising the basis of everything and you're not changing relations among the things. So this is not a question that I can kind of deal with adequately at this time. I mean, I didn't prepare a talk about this, but that's indicating where I would be going in a full talk on this.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so there's two questions that are not really related to value. Let me just give you the essence of them quickly. You can see how you feel about answering them. One is, what is the usefulness of the notion of an epistemological break in Marxist thought, early versus late? And the other is there room to accommodate the concept of false and true needs in Marxist theory? Two different questions.
Right. Well, I mean, epistemological break takes us back to Louis Althusser.
Yeah, I should say that was the questioner's context.
Yeah. I mean, I just don't think that this should be taken seriously, because I don't think Althusser really had a clue as to what he was talking about. And, you know, even you look at the way he talks about it, he says, oh, well, actually there's this epistemological break, but there's like these traces of Hegelian influence in Capital, and there's only two texts, Notes on Wagner and the Critique of the Gotha program, where Marx fully breaks from Hegelianism. And the thing about both of those texts is they're very short. And neither of them were published. And, you know, they just don't count as evidence at the same level that something like Capital, which is worked for publication and reworked. So, I mean, basically, you know, Althusser is finding that he doesn't find expressions he dislikes in either of those short texts. But I mean, I don't think that anybody should take that too seriously, because he just doesn't know he just didn't know what he was talking about, really, unfortunately. True needs, untrue needs. I mean, obviously Marx thought that needs, usefulness, all that kind of stuff are not fixed in human beings for all time, that needs develop, they change. And, you know, he talked about, for instance, how needs would change in a different society, the need for association, the need for self-development. And he didn't have a lot to say about this, but I mean, his views are very clearly that needs are not just like some pre-given physical amounts, and that's all that there is to say about it. But he didn't write a lot about those things, you know, in comments here and there.
Thank you. This is how these things go, because they're at night. We have a lot of enthusiasm at the beginning. We get deeply into a topic, and then we all need to take a break. So I think this is the time to do that. We should thank Professor Kliman for his the fruit of a lot of work and giving us great food for thought. And thank you all for being here. Next week, we'll be back.